This video is part 3 in a series on Chapter 2 of Govern America, focusing on the Constitution. So, in the last video we were talking about the problems with the Articles of Confederation, and now we're going to get into what some of the states and some of the leaders of America at the time decided to do about it. And what they did was they were able to get the Congress of the United States to say, hey, let's send out an invitation, let's get everybody together in Philadelphia, and let's talk about how we can change and improve the Articles of Confederation. So 12 of the states, Rhode Island being the exception, did send representatives to Philadelphia in 1787. And pretty soon they decided that, you know what, we don't want to just change the Articles of Confederation. We really want to start from scratch and develop an entirely new set of rules and procedures for how the states are going to interact and be governed by the United States government. So the framers of the Constitution had some general goals, and one of those was that they wanted to make sure that they were able to manage the conflicts that would come up in the course of just the natural life of the country, because anytime you get a group of people together and they can't all get what they want, there's going to be conflict. So you have to manage that conflict. And one way of managing conflict would just be to say anytime there's a conflict, you have a vote and majority rules. But the framers didn't want to do that either. They didn't want to let a majority just run right over a minority. Now, if you think about American history, there have definitely been times where a majority did seem like they were running over a minority. Slavery would be clearly the chief example of this, but there have been others throughout America's history. But the example that a lot of the framers were probably thinking of more was that there were certainly more poor people or middle-class people in the United States than there were rich people. So if you have a majority rule system, it's conceivable that all of the poor and middle-class people could get together and gang up and say, hey, we'd like to take the money from all the rich people. And certainly a lot of the framers didn't want that. So that's just one reason why the Constitution was set up, so that you didn't have simple majority rule. You had things in place to kind of stop any group or any set of people from taking complete control over the government. Now, how were they going to go about achieving these goals? Let's talk about some of the compromises that the representatives had to make at the Constitutional Convention. One of them was just how much say was each state going to have in the new government. And you got to remember, just like today, you got some states that have a lot of people and some states that don't. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, where each of the states was treated as sort of its own little independent entity equal to all the others, each state had one vote. So that meant that a state like Virginia, that had a lot of people and was contributing a lot to the national economy, had exactly the same voice as a state like New Jersey, which had fewer people and might not be making as much of a contribution at the time. So, not surprisingly, the people in Virginia weren't happy about this, and the people from New Jersey were. So, when the states got together for the Constitutional Convention, there were a couple of different plans being suggested. Virginia had a plan where each state would get a say in the national government that was proportional to the size of its population. So if a state had more people, it would get more votes. So instead of treating the states equally, you were treating the people in the states equally. Whereas smaller states like New Jersey wanted to sort of keep the same system that the Articles of Confederation had, where each state got an equal voice. And so these two plans became known as the Virginia Plan, to give the big states a bigger say, and the New Jersey Plan, to give all the states the same say. And so then there was a Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, which basically said, let's do both. Let's have a bicameral legislature. Let's have a legislature that has two different groups or chambers. We'll have one chamber that follows the Virginia Plan, and the bigger states with more people will have more of a voice and more votes in the House of Representatives. But we'll also have another chamber, the Senate, which is going to follow the New Jersey Plan. Each state is going to have an equal voice in the Senate. As it turned out, each state gets 2 votes in the Senate, regardless of the population. So that was one way in which the states sort of had to compromise. Neither the large states nor the small states were able to completely get their way. Other compromises that had to be made involved the issue of slavery. There was not really much chance that anyone was going to officially ban slavery in the new Constitution. There were some small limits placed on it. The Congress was given the power at a later date, not right away, but at a later date, to prohibit the importing of new slaves from overseas. So after the early 1800s, the only way for there to be more slaves was basically to take the children of the existing generation of slaves and make them slaves as well. Another big question that came up about slaves is, are they going to count as part of the population? Because remember, we've just established that part of the Congress, a state's say in the Congress, is going to be determined by their population. If they have more people, they get more say. So the states where slavery was legal wanted to be able to count their slaves as people for this purpose. That would mean they would get more votes. The states that did not allow slavery, meanwhile, were not on board with this at all. They said, well, wait a minute, you can't, on the one hand, claim this group of people as property, and then say, on the other hand, that they need to have political representation. You can't do both. So what they came up with was another compromise. They said in the Constitution that they would count slaves as 3/5 of a person. So if you had 5 slaves, they would count as 3 for the population of the state in deciding how many votes they got in the House of Representatives. So if you ever hear someone talk about how at one point the United States considered slaves to be 3/5 of a person, this is why, because of the 3/5 compromise. Now, not every compromise that the framers made was as morally charged as the compromises they made about slavery. Some were more practical, like voting rights. Instead of setting a national standard and a national set of requirements, the Constitution basically says, okay, states set their rules for who votes in state elections. So something like voting for the governor of a state. And then whatever requirements you have to meet to be able to vote in your state, those are the requirements to meet in order to be able to vote in a national election. Which is why, even to this day, different states set up different rules about who's eligible to vote, and each state maintains its own voter rolls, and some states are now putting in voter ID laws and things like that. It's because the Constitution, left that to the states. And for the most part, at this point in time, when you're talking about voters, you're talking about white males, and in a lot of cases, white males who owned property. That was kind of where voting rights were. Should we let all the white men vote or just the ones that have land? So obviously, voting rights would expand a lot more over the next 200 years. Now, another thing that had to be resolved with this Constitution is exactly what was the relationship of the states going to be. Were they competing with each other the way different foreign countries compete with each other, or were they supposed to be colleagues and all sort of working on the same team? Under the Articles of Confederation, there was a lot more competition between the states, and they kind of were trying to get advantages over each other. You could, if I built a table in Pennsylvania and wanted to bring it into New Jersey to sell, New Jersey might charge me a fee, a tariff, in order to do that. Or they might set up other rules that would make it harder for me to do the business in New Jersey, because New Jersey wanted to protect New Jersey table makers. It was even, you even had issues about would different states sort of have different money systems or things like that. So the idea was that the framers of the Constitution decided we're not going to go that route. We are going to make sure that the national government is able to set the rules overall that the states will have to play by, so that there's more uniformity and a little more cooperation between the states. Finally, I want to just touch on a couple of the rights and protections that were in the actual text of the Constitution as it was originally written. A lot of the rights that we talk about are not in the Constitution as it was originally written. They were added in later. And we'll talk about the Bill of Rights in another video. But there are some things that were included right away. One of them is the right to habeas corpus. If you are arrested, the government can't just throw you in jail and say, we'll get around to charging you with something later. You, as the arrested person, are able to go to the courts and say, look, I want the government to tell me what I'm charged with and why. And if the government can't do that, I want to be let out. And today, if the government can't produce the charges, a judge will order a prisoner to be freed. So you can't throw somebody in jail and then figure out what you're going to charge them with. You actually have to have the charges ready. That's habeas corpus. The Constitution also prohibits Congress from passing bills of attainder. Bills of attainder are bills that single out a particular group for punishment for having done something, and punishes them without a trial. The idea there is, if you're going to create a punishment of some kind, and you're going to say something is wrong, you have to create a scenario where you're proving that this wrong thing happened. And if you don't do that, you can't just write a law that says, oh, this person's definitely guilty and they definitely have to get this punishment. And then finally, the government also cannot pass what are called ex post facto laws. Ex post facto means after the fact, basically. The government can't say that, okay, you did this thing yesterday and we realized we don't like it. So today we're going to pass a law that makes that illegal, and now we're going to arrest you for having broken this law that didn't exist at the time that you did what you did. That's just not fair. You can't change the rules and make them up as you go along. If you want to make something illegal for the future, you can do that, but you can't retroactively turn somebody into a criminal. So, again, there are more rights that we know of and that we're familiar with, but those would come later. These are some that were put in right away. They were deemed important enough that they had to be in the original text of the Constitution. Until the next video, I will now leave you with some questions for further thought.